Good evening, dear brothers and sisters. Once again, we meet in the name of God, and we again meet in the name of Christ. Today, what we are going to study is we are going to look into a prophecy from an Old Testament, and this prophecy is recorded in the book of Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel is a kind of a revelation book of the Old Testament, is because it contains numerous prophecies, and many of its vast prophecies are pertaining to the last days and the end times. Many of it. It also contains the last world war that could break out, and how human beings would survive, and how majority of them would be killed, and which other nations would go against many other nations. So Ezekiel is, in a nutshell, it contains a very detailed prophecy about God's plan for this world. Now, in that sense, there was also a prophecy that is recorded in the book of Ezekiel, which is called the Valley of Dry Bones. Now, this Valley of Dry Bones is a futuristic prophecy which is partially fulfilled, and it is also being fulfilled in our days, and it is yet to be fulfilled in the days to come. So today we will look into the prophecy titled Valley of Dry Bones. Now, where do we read this in the Bible? We can turn to Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 to 10. We would be able to read the Valley of Dry Bones. Now, here's how the prophecy goes. We won't have much time today to go through it by verse. I will read a couple of verses, but then a few of the verses I will just explain and keep moving forward. Now, the prophecy is in Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 to 10. If you read from it during the time that you have, you'd be able to see that this is how it unfolds. God calls Ezekiel, and in a vision, he lifts him up. He says, in the Spirit of the Lord. So God shows a vision to Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel is taken up in the Lord's Spirit, and he's placed in the midst of a valley. So Ezekiel is a prophet, right? So he goes to a midst of a valley, and he sees a lot of bones in the valley, and the bones are very dry. It's probably an aged bone because there's no flesh meat upon the bone is dry. And then God asks Ezekiel, can these bones live? Because these bones are like dead bones, and it's dry bones. So Ezekiel, he doesn't know the answer to it. He says, God, you know the answer to it. And then God tells to Ezekiel, you look at these bones and you start to prophesy on these bones. Now, when Ezekiel starts to talk to these bones according to what God instructed him, he is then able to see those bones which were scattered across the valley, across the dry valley. These dry bones, they all start to regather themselves. And then these bones start to join with other bones. They attach themselves with different parts of the other bones that are scattered. And eventually, the bone becomes a skeletal structure, like how we have a skeletal structure. The bone then turns into a skeleton structure. And then and then nerves are given to the bones, flesh is given to the bones, and then finally the skin appears on the bones. So it's basically regenerating what was completely withered away. So the bones regather, and then the skeletal structure is formed. The nerves are being placed within these bones. Flesh is given to the bones. Now it's like a flesh, nerves, bones, and then skin is placed on the bone, on the entire flesh. So then this bones, which is like into a shape now, they stand as an army. Now Ezekiel looks into it, but they still do not have life in it. They still do not have life. So then God tells to Ezekiel, you prophesy to the wind. And then he says, it's a very peculiar thing that happens. He tells to Ezekiel, you prophesy to the four winds. Now Ezekiel prophesies to the four winds, and then breath of life comes into this army that is just standing. Now they still don't have the life, but it's like a large army that is standing. When Ezekiel prophesied to the wind, the life from the wind comes into this great standing army, and then they become alive again, and they are like a very strong army that stands. Now this is what Ezekiel sees in the vision. And what does this have to do into our lives today? And why are we supposed to read this? Is it even necessary? Because there's been a lot of songs and hymns that are written about the valley of dry bones and these verses. But what is the meaning of these prophecy? Does this prophecy look into the future of our coming days? How do we understand this? Now, this is what we are going to unfold in today's discussion. Now, like Ezekiel, he looked up to God and he said, "Oh God, you know." We'll also let us also look up to God and say, "God, what does these bones represent?" Now, all the bones that are withered away, dried, and they're all scattered, they are regathered, and then an army is created and formed out of this dead, dry bones. God, what does this bone represent? Now, let's ask that question and try to read the verse which God. So, let's read Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 11. So, what does he say? Then he said to me, "Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up and our hope has perished. We are completely cut off." So God gives us the metaphor. He says the bones that Ezekiel saw is the whole house of Israel. What is the meaning of the whole house of Israel? The whole house of Israel means the 12 tribes, the entire nation, all the descendants from Jacob. So they were the one who formed the Israel nation, right? They are the ones who went into the land of Canaan. So he says that the whole, all the people, all the Jewish people are these dry bones. So which means that Israel as a nation, they withered away. Then they became like a dry bone. They were scattered. And then finally, when the prophecy was said, they were regathered again, and they stood up like an army. So this is the first level of understanding into the prophecy. I'll reiterate once again. The dry bones that Ezekiel saw, like God explains in Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 11, he says the bones are the whole house of Israel. So keeping this in mind, let us now unlock and go a little more deeper into this prophecy. Now, why do we need this? Let's get a basic understanding of the prophecies relating to Israel. Now, Israel is can also be called and compared to God's time clock. The reason behind calling Israel as God's time clock is because if we look at a certain event, if we look at events that are happening in Israel, and if those events are prophesied already in the Bible, we would know at what age of a time, at what time of the world that we are surviving and living in. More, how long would it pass before this age can completely evaporate, which is in fire, be burnt away, and the new age, which is the third world where righteousness dwells, will be established. In simple, the visible kingdom of Jesus Christ, establishment of the visible kingdom of Christ. Now, to know that, it's very important that as students of the Bible, we look into the prophecies that are spoken about Israel in from the Bible, because it gives us a clear time prophecy as to what age and time we are living in. Um, so, keeping this thought in mind, let's go to the background about this prophecy. Now, when was this prophecy told? The prophecy of Ezekiel, the vision of Ezekiel that we just read right now, that is the valley of dry bones. When did this happen? Now, this entire thing happens during the time when Ezekiel was captured and he was taken into Babylon as captivity. And we know that Babylon was once ruled by King Nebuchadnezzar, and King Nebuchadnezzar attacked the kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Judah was the two tribes, like the Judah and Benjamin. And then you have the 10 tribes towards the northern territory of the Israel map. And the southern territory is where the Judah and Benjamin lived. So King Nebuchadnezzar attacks the Judah kingdom, that is the Benjamin and the tribe of Judah, three times. And then he takes all of them into captivity into Babylon. And that's the time when Daniel and Daniel's friends went, Ezekiel went, and many of the other people also went into desolation. Where the Bible tells the terms as the period of desolation, or a period of 70 years when the land was left desolate, that they went into Babylon's captivity. Now, this is the time when Ezekiel is in Babylon, and while he was in Babylon, is when he looks into this prophecy, or is when he looks into this vision of the valley of dry bones. And it's been close to about 2629 years, more or less, as on today. The prophecy was then shown to Ezekiel in the form of a vision, and we are ahead of our time right now, about 2600 plus years. And now we are looking into this prophecy, because in our days, my dear brothers and sisters, in our days, this prophecy that we are looking into has the final climax. It has the final ending of what we will study today. So let's get a little more detailed into it. Now, when Ezekiel, all of this, you check you read your verses when you have the time. Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 4 to 6. He gives the process on how these bones would survive. So, firstly, is that he says that you look into the bones and you prophesy. When you prophesy, all these bones will regather. So, the first event that needs to happen in this vision is the regathering of the dry bones. And who are the dry bones? The dry bones are the entire house of Israel. So the first process is regathering of the bones. And after regathering the bones, the nerves will have to be established. Once the nerves are formed, then the flesh is placed, that's the muscles. And after the muscles are placed, skin is supposed to be placed on these bones. And finally, they stand up, but they still do not have life in them. And then what happens is that Ezekiel looks at the forewind and he prophesies to the forewind. And he hears a thundering sound and a quake. He hears a great noise. And from that wind, from the forewind, from the great noise, from the shaking, comes a life giving spirit that comes upon these skeletons who are still not alive, and the entire army that just stood in front of Ezekiel is now alive. So that's the process. Let's recollect the thoughts into the process again. Is regathering of the bones, placing nerves, flesh, skin, and then finally giving them the breath of life. Now that's the process in gathering the nation of Israel, because God said the dry bones represent the house of Israel, which means the house of Israel will have to first become dry. Only when they become dry will they be regathered. You get that, dear brothers and sisters? The house of Israel will have to be first dry, left desolate. They'll have to become dry, because the bones, they were not fresh bones taken out of a live human being, or just dead. No, the bones were scattered, and they were. It's been a long time, because that is when, at the scorching heat of the sun, the bone over a period of time is become dry, which means and if bones represent the house of Israel, then the house of Israel will have to be scattered first, and they'll have to be scattered for a very long time. After the scattering, they will have to be regathered. Now, that is the prophecy and the vision that was shown to Ezekiel. With this in mind, let us go and understand, when did the scattering happen? When was the bones, that is the house of Israel, scattered? And for how long were they scattered? And when was the regathering occurred? And has life come into them right now? Has life not come into them? What stage of the prophecy are we in today, living in 2023? That's what we're going to examine. Now, the scattering happens during the time of Jesus, or after the time of Jesus. Now, Jesus in Matthew chapter 28, verses 37 and 38, he gives a kind of a futuristic event that will happen to the nation of Israel. He looks into Jerusalem, and he says, "Oh Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how long have I called you? Like a hen that calls her chicks. She likes to keep her chicks safe. I've been calling you for so long, but you do not have the heart to come to me." Jesus looks into Jerusalem and he talks to them. And he says, "Your house will be left desolate for you." And that's a very key verse in today's discussion, because he says that your house will become desolate. And we read in Ezekiel chapter 37, it said that the bones are the entire house of Israel. And Jesus says, "Your house will be left desolate." So the bones will have to first scatter into different parts of the valley, and then they will have to stay there for a long period of time. Only then they will become dry without any hope. Now, did this happen? Did the scattering of Israel happen? It very much happened. And Jesus gave another parable for us to understand that this would take place. And this parable is called the parable of the wedding feast. And we have studied that in detail. I'll just give a glimpse of the parable of the wedding feast. Now, in the parable of the wedding feast, Jesus talks about a future event that is to occur on the nation of Israel, but he talks in the form of parabolic statements. Now, in this parable, he brings the metaphor as the following. He says there was a king, and the king wanted to set up a wedding banquet for his son. So what the king does is he sends out his servants to invite or to remind the ones who are already invited. To remind the ones who are already invited. So the servants go to the people. They start to remind them, saying that the wedding is very close. Please come to the banquet. But the guests who were worthy to attend, they were the worthy ones. The guests who were worthy to attend, they did not have a heart to come to the wedding banquet. Instead, they started to give reasons, lame reasons to the servants. They said to themselves and to the servant that we've just purchased a plot of land and we've purchased a herd of sheep and I have my business. I cannot come. Now, the king, once again, he sends out his servants again, and then he says, the fattened calf has been slaughtered. He says that there has been a kill. The fattened calf has been slaughtered, and the master is calling you all to attend the wedding banquet. But the ones who are worthy to attend, that the worthy guest, what they do is they try to insult the servants, and few more, they catch hold of the servants and they kill them. Now, the king was very angry and furious about this behavior. So, what the king does is he sends an army. He sends an army to the city, and then he burns down the entire city and he kills all of them. And then finally, the king says the wedding banquet is ready, the marriage feast has arrived. The ones who are worthy became unworthy and they did not come to the wedding banquet. So he calls his servant and he says, go to the roadside, go to the highways, go wherever you can, and find whoever it is possible that you can find and invite them to the wedding banquet. And everyone started to flood into the wedding banquet, and the wedding banquet overflowed with guests. We've read this, the parable of the wedding feast, right? Now, if we look at if we connect the parable of the wedding feast to the nation of Israel, because that parable is pertaining to the future event. Now, this is how it unfolds. There was a king. The king is Father God. The king prepared a wedding feast for his son. Exactly like God the Father or Father God, he prepares a wedding feast for his son. Not God the Son, not Son the God, but Son of God. Let's be very careful with wording these sentences. Only there is one God, and that one God is Father himself. Jesus is the Son of God. Now he prepares a wedding feast for his son. And who is the son? The son is Christ, and we know. And who are the worthy ones? The worthy ones were the nation of Israel, because Jesus came to his own, and his own did not accept him. The salvation was first given to the Jews, and because they denied the salvation, did the good news of the gospel come to us as the Gentile nation. Now, if you look closely into the parable, the calling was sent to the ones who were worthy to come and attend the wedding banquet. When even before Jesus could come, through John the Baptist and through many prophets, the word went out to the Jews first, asking them to come to the righteous calling, asking them to come to the eternal life, but they did not come. Now, after the death of Jesus Christ, the apostles and many several disciples again went to the Jews and they said, Jesus has been killed. Like in the parable, they say the fattened ox has been slaughtered. Here they say Jesus has been ransomed. He's given his life as a ransom. He has been given his life as a sacrifice, as a Passover lamb. Kindly come to the wedding banquet. They made the call. Peter, Apostle Paul, disciple Barnabas, they all went and they called the Jews, but the Jews did not want to come. Instead, they insulted, they stoned, and they killed the prophets. Right now, what the king did is, in the parable, the king sends an army and he burns the city. Now, this is exactly when the nation of Israel became desolate. Now, in AD 70, in the year 70 AD, there was a Roman general. His name, he led a Roman army. His name was called the General Titus. Now General Titus leads a Roman army, and he comes walking straight into Jerusalem, because at that point in time, in Jerusalem, in the nation of Israel, there was a group called as the Zealots. Now Jesus also had a disciple called Simon the Zealot in his apostleship. Now these zealots where, like, the Romans categorized the zealots as terrorists, because they always used to try to rebel against the Roman emperor. They did not want a Roman emperor to rule over the Jews. They were like what you call the Jewish freedom fighters, but the Romans persuaded them as terrorists. Now these group of people, the zealots, they started to outspring in numbers, and this is one of the reason that the general Titus, he leads an army to invade Jerusalem. They burn Jerusalem's temple to its rubble, exactly like Jesus prophesied, saying that, looking into Solomon's temple, he says, one stone will not be left on another stone. They bring down the temple to its feet. They bring it to its rubble. They burn the temple, and that is exactly the time when the Jewish nation and the Jews scattered all across the globe. They ran into Russia, the northern kingdom. They ran to the Europe. They ran into different parts of the world. They just left the land. The nation of Israel, the land that was given to Abraham's descendant, became desolate. And this would happen is because there is already a prophecy mentioned in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verses 26, as to that this event was already foretold in a prophecy. I'll read from it. Then after 62 weeks, now this prophecy is called the 70 weeks, and we have read about the 70 weeks prophecy exactly here. We've studied that. So then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince, now look at this, and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come. Now the prince who was ruling Israel was the emperor. Now the people of the prince is his army. Now the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city, the entire nation of Israel, and the sanctuary, the temple. Sanctuary is the temple. Temple is the Solomon temple. The Roman army came and burnt the sanctuary, that is the Solomon's temple. They burnt the city, the entire nation of Israel. And look at this. And its end will come with a flood, like a flood coming in and swooping away all the living creatures, right? They just came and swooped away all of the entire nation of Israel. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. The land was left desolate after the war that came on Israel, that is on AD 70. Now, this is what Ezekiel also foresaw in his vision. Ezekiel sees that the bones, which was the nation of Israel, was dry. It was scattered in the valley. Now, what we are just seeing now is just the beginning of the scattering of the bones. But the bones have still not become dry. But they just started to scatter. And God has already prophesied, not just here, in many such places. Let's read from Zechariah chapter 7, verses 14. He says, but I scattered them with a strong wind among all the nations whom they have not known. Thus the land is desolated behind them, so that no one went back and forth, for they made the pleasant land desolate. The nation of Israel and the land of Israel was left desolate for a very long period of time. For a very, very long period of time. Now we'll have to first find out how long they were left desolate. We'll also have to see, why did God punish them? What is the reason? And how were these bones regathered? Now, to understand this, I hope so far you're able to follow. But if not, kindly I request you all to unmute yourself. And if you have any questions, please feel free to stop in between. Because this prophecy that we're studying in today is like few steps ahead compared to what we have previously in our past discourse read about. So let's read this again, Zechariah chapter 7, verses 14. But I scattered them with a storm wind among all nations. Like it was prophesied in Zechariah, the entire nation of Israel was scattered into all parts of the world. And that scattering begun when the nation was invaded. Not invaded, but when the entire nation was led by the Roman army, and then they were burnt to its rubble, and all people ran away from the land of Israel. Okay. Now, what we need to understand next is the next step that we need to look into is, okay, now we know that this is when the bones, that is the nation of Israel, started to scatter. Now, for how long will they be in the scattered condition? How long will they be in a scattered condition? Say, for instance, I say I'm going to a different nation. How long will I be in that nation? We need a definitive time frame, right? How long I will stay there and return back to my home. You know the beginning. Now we know the beginning, that the scattering happened at this point in time. Now, for how long will they be scattered? Because they should have been scattered for a very long time. Only then the bones will become dry. Now, for how long were they scattered? There is a very interesting verse in Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 18. God gives another prophecy saying, how long this people, that's the nation of Israel, the bones, will be scattered. He says in Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 18, that he will punish their iniquity twice as much. The word rendered there is double. It would say, Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 18, it will say, I will punish them for their iniquities a double time, twice. So when we read this, we will understand that double or twice means if they have if they have received a blessing from God for 1 year, they will be punished for like 2 years, right? Because that's what double means. You can refer this once again, Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 18. He says, like for the days that I have blessed Israel, I will punish them. Now that's the measurement that God takes. A very simple way to understand this is, if God had blessed Israel for 10 years, the duration of punishment that they will receive from God is double of the 10 years. Now when I say double of the 10 years, it does not mean 20 years, because double of 10 is 20. You multiply that by 2. No. Now I'm going to show you the Greek meaning for this. The Greek word for this is called mishne, which means, yeah, you can look at the underlining statement. This is the Greek word that was used for the word double. It says repetition. Repetition means a equal corresponding portion, that is duplicate. If God has blessed Israel for 10 years, they will receive a punishment for 10 years, an equal portion, a duplicate portion, a repetition portion, right? Let's recall this once again. What are we studying today? The prophecy of Ezekiel. Why did we study? Because Ezekiel looked into the valley of dry bones, and the dry bones started to reappear. Now, who is the dry bones? The dry bones is the house of Israel. If the bones will have to become dry, that means the bones will have to be thrown into the valley, that is scattered in the valley. Now, if Israel is the bones, when did they start to get scattered? They started to get scattered after the death of Christ, that is in that time frame. Now, for how long were they in scattered condition? Because they should have been for a very long time. Only after that they have become dry without any hope. So, how long were they in scattered condition? To find that time period of how long they were in a scattered condition is why we read Jeremiah prophecy. Now, in the prophecy of Jeremiah, he said that he will render unto them a double portion, an equal portion, or a repetition portion, or a duplicate portion, which means if God had given them a grace for 10 years, the nation of Israel will be punished for 10 years. Now, the next thing that we need to find in our discourse is, how long did the nation of Israel receive the blessings from God? Or rather, how long were they called as a Jewish age? Now, there's different ages in the Bible, right? We are living in the gospel age, because for us, the light is gospel, and of course, the Old Testament as well. But we are living in the time when the gospel is being preached. But when the Jews lived, it was called as a term the Jewish age. And before the Jews, it was called as a patriarchal age. Patriarchal age means the age of the fathers, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They were called the fathers of Israel. They were also called as the patriarchs, which is why in many places we would read the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and then the verses just stops. Is because they were considered as the patriarchs, that is, the fathers of Israel. When the 12 nations, when the 12 tribes that came out of Jacob, when the 12 tribes came out of Jacob, then they were called as the Jewish kingdom, which means from that point in time, the Jewish era started. God started to deal and talk only with them, not with anyone else. Now, in our finding out about this prophecy, we need to go into the next step, a furthermore step into finding out how long did the nation of Israel or the Jewish people were under the guidance of God. For how long were they called children of God? For how long did they receive the grace from God? For how long did God deal with them? If we find this duration, then we will be able to easily understand that this is the duration that they will then be punished. You get that, dear brothers and sisters? Because Jeremiah said the God will punish them an equal portion, which is a duplicate portion, like double, for the days that they received blessings from God, they will also receive punishment from God. Now, what we are going to find, how long did they deal with God? How long did God deal with these people? How long were they under the guidance of God? How long did they receive grace from God? We'll need to find the number of years that they lived in this condition. Now, to find this, a very key verse is given by Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians, chapter 3, verses 17. He says it's a 430 years. You can make a note of it. Galatians chapter 3, verses 17. Apostle Paul gives a very important calculation, a year calculation here. He says, from the time Abraham received the covenant till the time the law was given, 430 years elapsed. I'll repeat this again. Apostle Paul gives a year count. He says, from the time Abraham received the covenant. Now, when did Abraham receive the covenant? Abraham received the covenant when he was called from his land, the land of the Chaldeans, or called as a Mesopotamia, or his place called the Ur, right? When Abraham was in the land of the Chaldeans, that is when God gave him the promise saying, Abraham, go to the land that I will show you, leave your house and leave your people, leave your land, go to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will give you numerous descendants from you. So God has already promised him, and he brings him out. The covenant was given to Abraham at the time of his calling. Now, that's what Apostle Paul refers this to. He says, from the time Abraham was called till the time the law was given, 430 years elapsed. Now, when was the law given? When we say law, we only think about the Ten Commandments, or we think about the laws that are written in the laws according to the laws of Moses. And when do we say that it was given? We say it was given at Mount Sinai, right? But at Mount Sinai, the law was made complete, it was given fully. But the first law was not given at Mount Sinai. The first law was given when the nation of Israel, to be Israel, when the Jews lived in Egypt, when the first law was given when the people were still living in Egypt. Now, the first law of the entire law book is the law of the Passover festival. The Passover festival, God gives it as a law to them. He says, you will have to do this every year. And what is this Passover festival? We've studied this, dear brothers and sisters. The Passover festival was given during the 10th plague, when the Hebrew people, that's the Jews, they will have to select a lamb, and they will have to bring the lamb on the 10th day into their house, keep the lamb for about 4 days, and on the fourth day slaughter the lamb, take the blood out of the lamb and smear it on the lamb, on the doorpost. You remember that? We've seen that, the 10th plague. Now that Passover was the first law of the law book. Now this is what Apostle Paul says. From the time the covenant was given, which is calling of Abraham, till the time the law was given, that is the Passover festival, 430 years elapsed, he's saying. So far clear? Now, what are we trying to find here? We are in an attempt to find the number of years that the nation of Israel, or the Jewish people, were favored by God. They were under God's direct guidance. Now, to find that, Paul gives this clue. He says 430 years from the time Abraham was called till the time the law was given, 430 years. Now, keeping this in mind, we are going to the next most important chart. I would want everyone to take a look at this on your screens, is because this 430, we have split the 430 into four parts to understand. Now, what are we trying to understand? We want to understand how long did the people of the Jewish people were favored by God. Because if we know that time period, we will know that is the time period that they will be disowned, that they will be disfavored, they will be punished. And if we know that period, we can easily go back to Ezekiel prophecy again. So let's examine this. Abraham was called from the land, right? What was Abraham's age when Abraham was called? Abraham was 75 years when Abraham was called. So when Abraham was called, the law was given and Abraham is called. Abraham is how many years? 75 years. Now when Abraham is 100 years, his son Isaac was born. Let's please keep notes on these, dear brothers and sisters. When Abraham was 100 years, Isaac was born. So how many years was it elapsed from his calling to the birth of Isaac? When Abraham was called, 75 years. When Isaac was born, Abraham was 100 years. So how many years was elapsed? 25 years. Because Abraham was called at 75 and his son was born at 100. So the period is 25 years. You get that, right? Now, the next piece that we need to find is, at what age did Isaac give birth to Jacob? Now, for that, the Bible answers. The Bible gives the verse in Genesis chapter 25, verses 26. It says, when Isaac was 60 years, he gave birth to Jacob. So let's count this again. 25 years, 60 years. Altogether, you get 85 years, right? Let's keep that aside. Now, how long did Jacob live? Again, the Bible answers. Genesis chapter 47, verses 28. He says Jacob lived 147 years. You get that? Jacob lived 147 years. So let's again do the math. From calling of Abraham to the birth of Isaac, 25 years. When Isaac was 60 years, Jacob was born, so 60 years. Jacob lived for 147 years. So in total, if we tally all of that, if we calculate all of it, if we sum up all of it, it is 230 years, which means from the time Abraham was called till the time Jacob died, it was 232 years. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the time frame given for the patriarchs ended. The patriarchs are done, because the patriarchs are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they are done. Now we still have the bigger umbrella, right? 430 years is the time frame that Apostle Paul gives. Now what we're looking at is, we're looking at the sub times within that 430. Now let's take this 430, which Apostle Paul gives, and now we have 232 years. How did we get the 232 years? 25 years from Abraham to Isaac, 60 years from Isaac to Jacob. Jacob lived for 147 years. When we sum this up, we get 232. So next what we need to do is we need to subtract, because we want to know how long was the Jewish age. The Jewish age is the time when the Jews were favored by God. So the Jewish age, the patriarch's age ended. After the patriarch's age, the Jewish age will start. After the Jewish age, it's the gospel age. After the gospel age, it's the messianic age. The messianic age is a 1,000-year kingdom of Christ, right? So the patriarch's age ended, and now the Jewish age starts. That's what is very important for us. So let's take this 430 and subtract it with the 232 that we just got, that we just received, right? So if we subtract, if we take off the 232 from 430, we get 198 years, which means the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, were in slavery. They lived in Egypt for 198 years. Did we know this before? Did we know that the people, the Jewish people, were under the bondage of Egyptians for 198 years? I don't think so. But Paul gives this a reference, but he gives it in an umbrella, and we then go and try to get the verses and see what all happened in the 430 years. So 198 years is a time period that the people, the Hebrews, lived in Egypt. After 198 years, they come out because the law was given, and the law is the 10th plague. The 10th plague is when the law was introduced. That's the lamb, the Passover lamb. And at the Passover lamb festival, they just come out, right? On that very night, they come out. So now we got a time frame. 198 years is when the Hebrews lived in Egypt. Now we need to go to the next time. Now what happens after that? They lived in Egypt for 198 years. Then what happened? They came out of Egypt, right? They came out of Egypt and they had to go to Canaan. Now how long did it take for them to go to Canaan land? It just didn't take 40 years. There's another year missing. Another you're missing is, we look into this in the coming weeks. There's biblical verses for this. Now what happens is, when they leave Egypt, they straight away they will have to go to a place called as Paran. So from Egypt to Paran, it takes 1 year for them to walk and go to Paran. Now after Paran, they live in the wilderness for 40 years. They roam around the wilderness. Wherever the cloud goes, they travel with the cloud. They settle with the cloud. So they live in wilderness for about 40 years. 1 year from Egypt to Paran, 40 years in the wilderness. Totally how many years? 41. Now, after that, they go to the land of Canaan. They go to the Canaan land. Now, when they go to the Canaan land, they simply cannot go and settle wherever they like, right? They will have to have the land divided. So Joshua was tasked with the division of land. What Joshua does is, he divides the land. Are you from the tribe of Benjaminite? All right, your land is here. Are you from the tribe of Judah? All right, you live here. You from Dan? Go there. Are you from the tribe of Reuben? All right, your land belongs there. So he will have to divide the land, and he gives it to the people. Now, how long did it take for him to divide the land? 5 years. Is it there in the Bible? Everything that we see today is there in the Bible. So it took about 5 years for him to divide the land, and he gives the land. Now, totally, how many years have elapsed? 198 years. They lived in Egypt. Then they have 1 year from Egypt to Paran. 40 years they roam in the wilderness. And when they go to the land of Canaan, it took 5 years for Joshua to divide the land. In total, now we have 46, which is 1 year, 40 years, 5 years. That is the next. That's the next segregation that you see on the chart. The first segregation is 198. The second segregation is 46. What does the 46 represent? I just explained it to you. 1 year from Egypt to Paran, 40 years in the wilderness, and then 5 years, the division of the land. Now, after the land was divided, what happened next? God gives them judges, and we've known some judges, right? Simpson, then we have Barak, then we have Gideon. So many judges we've read about. Deborah. So they were all judges that was given to judge the Jews, to judge the people of Israel, because they needed someone to guide them. Now, how long did the judge? How long did the judge over Israel? Do we know that? Yes. Is there a biblical verse? Yes. It's there in Acts chapter 13, verses 19 to 21. He says the judges ruled over Israel for 450 years. And that is what you see in the third section within the category. You have 450, right? 450 years is the period of the judges who ruled over Israel. Again, 198 years is what they lived in Egypt. 46 years from Egypt to coming into the land and dividing the land. After dividing the land, God gives them judges. That's 450 years. Now, after Judges, what happens after Judges? Now, Samuel lived. After Samuel, the people of Israel, they go to Samuel and they start to rebel with him. They say, we don't need judges. Enough of these judges. I just look at the other nations. They are so wealthy and they're so prosperous. It's because they have kings. So now we need kings. We need kings. They start to rebel against Samuel and God. So God talks to Samuel and he says, all right, they've rejected not you, they've rejected me because I was their king. Now they're asking for a king. All right, give them a king. So God anoints Saul from the tribe of Benjaminite as the first king. Then David comes, Solomon comes. So how long? How long? Again, the time period. How long did the kings rule over Israel? Do we know that? Yes, we know. How can we find that? By taking all the kings and looking at all the years they ruled. It's there in the Bible. So now I'm going to display a certain table for y'all. You can take a look at this table. It'll be available later in the resources. So here you see Saul was the first king. And where is it mentioned? Acts chapter 13, verses 21. How many years did Saul reign? 40 years. Again, David, which what's the biblical reference? First Chronicles chapter 29, verse 27. How long did he reign? 40 years. Solomon, again, Second Chronicles 9:30. How long did he reign? 40 years. So if we sum up all the kings that reigned and ruled over Israel, we will be able to get, you know, how many years? 513 years was the period of kings. 513 years is how long is the duration when the kings ruled over Israel. Now let's go back to our table. 198 years they lived in Egypt. 46 years Egypt, Paran, wilderness, division of the land. Then you have 450 years, the period of judges. 513 years, the period of kings. Now, after the last king was King Zedekiah. Now, after the last king of Israel, God sends Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, right? So the Babylonian king, he comes and he takes everyone into captivity. He takes them to Babylon. How long was the nation of the Israel, the Jewish people, into captivity, that was into Babylon? That is 70 years. Where do we see this? We see this in in the book of Daniel. So 70 years is the duration of their captivity. The land was left desolate for 70 years. Okay, so that's the next category that we're seeing. Now, after the desolation, from the time of the desolation, till the time Messiah, till the time Jesus arrived, till the time Jesus was born, it took 536 years. Now, how do we know this? Is because there is a certain reverse calculation that we will need to do. We cannot look into that today. The time will just overshoot like anything. But we will study about this when we discuss in detail about the biblical chronology, which we will in the coming weeks. In the biblical chronology, we will look at time frame from Adam till Jesus. How long did it take? Who was born? What is the duration? So in that time, we'll also look into the 536 more detail. The number 536 is the time from the desolation, that is 70 years, they go into Babylon, right, as prisoners. After the end of 70 years, it 536 years later, Jesus was born. And then finally you have 32. 32 is the representation of the number of years that Jesus lived here. Wait. Didn't Jesus live 33 and a half years? Why are we saying 32? It is because there is a miscalculation, which is many people calculate AD 0, but the number 0 was only found, was only introduced by an Indian scholar called Aryabhatta. And Aryabhatta did not come at that point in time. He only comes in AD, not in BC. So the number 0 was not there at that point in time, the calculation system, which is why it is 32 years and not 33. But we know he lived for 33. So with this reference, we get the total value. Let's recount it. 198 years, 46, 450. By now you know what these all means, right? 513 period of kings, 70 years period of desolation that is gone into Babylon, 536 years for the birth of Christ, 32 years is walk here. When we calculate all of this, we get a period called 1845. 1845 years was a number of years that represented the Jewish age. Now, when did this end? It ends with the death of Christ, because at the death of Christ, the calling stopped. It did not just remain with the Jews. The calling was then later opened up to the Gentiles. At the death of Christ, the Jewish nation started to become disfavored from him. God favored the people of Israel for 1845 years. And Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 18 says that God will punish them an equal portion, a duplicate portion, a double, which means if 1845 years they have been favored from God, then for 1845 years they will be disfavored from God. Now, how do we, from where do we start this calculation? In AD 33, in AD 33, Jesus is crucified. At that point in time, the Jewish nation, they started to become disfavored, because when Jesus was alive, he himself says that your house will be left desolate. And then he says, you cannot come to me unless you invite the prophets again. So the nation starts to become desolate. And at his death is the time when this disfavor begins. So what we'll do is, let's take the year that Jesus died, AD 33, and let's take the period 1845. 1845 is nothing but the calculation of all of these favored times to the Jews. 1845, we will get 1878 AD. So, which means the Jewish nation was disfavored from AD 33 to AD 1878, is the time when they received the punishment from God. Now, did this happen? Very much. Now, what we just calculated and studied, it also implies a lot into history. So today we look a little further into history. It'll be a little detailed class today. So please don't mind me taking 10-15 minutes a little up and down. But let's try and see all of this in today's session itself. Now, let's go back to our prophecy. Our prophecy is in Ezekiel. Now, in Ezekiel, he says the valley of dry bones. The bones represent the house of Israel. They started to become desolate. The disfavorment starts in AD 33, the death of Christ. How long will they be left in the valley so that the bones will become dry? It is 1845 years. They will be left into the valley and they'll be left desolate. Now, God will have to regather them, right? God will have to regather them after the punishment is done. The way he will regather them is given in the book of Jeremiah, again a prophetical verse. In Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 37, he says, behold, I will gather them out of all the countries. Now Israel is scattered, right? God says, I will gather them out from all the countries, whither I have driven them in mine anger and in my fury and in the greatest wrath. And I will bring them again into this place, that's the nation of Israel, and I will cause them to dwell safely. So he's saying, after the period of this punishment is over, I will regather them. Okay, how are you going to regather, God? What is the means that you would use to regather the nation once again? Again, he says that in Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 15 and 16. Let's read this. And says, and as the Lord lives who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of the north and from all the countries. Now, look at this very specifically. He says the land of north. You take the map now when you have the time and take a look at the north country of Israel. You will see Russia. That is why many Israels settled in Russia. You get that, dear brothers and sisters? That's what he says. I will bring them from all the north country and from all the countries where he had banished them, for I will restore them to their own land, which I gave to their fathers. He says, I will do this. Now, how will God do this? Again, he says in verse 16, behold, I am going to send for many fishermen. God is going to send many fishermen, declares the Lord, and they will fish for them. And afterward, I will send for many hunters. They will hunt them from every mountain and every hill and from the cliffs of the rock, which means God is going to regather them. But the regathering process is sending out fishermen. And after the fishermen, he will send out hunters. They will hunt the Jewish people and they will bring them back to the nation of Israel. Now, if we look into history, after the Israelites they dispersed from their lands, right? That they went out from their land. After they moved out, Romans ruled over that land. It became desolate. After the Romans, Arabians came. Then a group of people called the Seljukians, they came. The Crusaders. Then you have the Turkish Muslims, the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Muslims. The land just kept changing hands, but no one could do anything with the land because the land just became so rotten and it turned into a wilderness, into nothing, into a desolate land until the time the people of Israel could reunite back to the land. Why we are studying this today is because this prophecy has a far more implication into the second coming of Jesus Christ, which is why every Christian should know this, the prophecy of Israel, the prophecy of Ezekiel. Now we just read in Jeremiah 16:16, right? What he would do, he would send the Jews, he would send the fishermen, and after the fishermen, he will send the hunter. So let's remember this. What is the period that their punishment will end? It will end in 1878 AD. How did we get this number? AD 33, they start to become disfavored. 1845 is the period that they were favored from the death of Jacob till the death of Jesus Christ. 1845 years, 1845 years. That was the time for the Jewish age. And after that, the gospel age started. The Jewish age were disfavored. For how many years will they be disfavored? Equal portion, which means we take that 1845 years, 1845, and we add it up with AD 33, we'll get 1878 AD. Let's please make a note of all these. AD 1878. Just keep it and circle it up. We look into history now if this happened. So we go further. What happens is from here on, he says, I will send the fishermen, right? And fisher, you know how fishes are fished, how fishermen will fish the fish. They have the fishing hook. You have a bait like a small worm. You have different kinds of bait. So you pierce the bait and you cast the hook into the water, and then you wait for the fish to start chewing up on the bait, and then you catch the fish, right? And that is how, one by one, slowly, one by one, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel was caught. They were caught one by one. How? In 1878, my dear brothers and sisters, and I'm not making up this year, I will show you proofs from history as well. In 1878, Then superpowers. The superpowers in 1878 was Russia, Great Britain, France, Austria, Hungary, Italy, and Germany. All of them came together and they formed something called as the Berlin Congress of Nations. It comprised of the superpower, and they came up with a treaty. It is called the Treaty of Berlin. You can study this, it's available on the internet. Treaty of Berlin. Now in the Treaty of Berlin, it's called the Congress, the Berlin Congress of Nation. In the Treaty of Berlin, they declared and said that civil rights will have to be given to the Jews in their homeland. Now, you see, until 1878, no one even spoke about asking the Jews to come back to their land. But in 1878, a treaty was passed saying that the Jews will have to be given civil rights. Is there a proof? I'm just sharing my screen right now. You can take a look at this. This screenshot is not. I didn't create this. It's taken from Wikipedia. You can look into Wikipedia and you can type Congress of Berlin. It was formed from 13th June, and for a month, 13th July 1878 is when the Congress of Berlin commenced. And you can look at the last second line, which is highlighted in amber. It says civil rights for the Jews in the region. I'll read that. The leaders of the Congress, German Chancellor, all this name, he says, I've just cut into half. They wanted to encourage the development of civil rights for Jews in the region. And when did this happen? 1878. And our Bible prophecy says that in 1878 the time for Jewish nation is once again starts to bloom, is because so long they were disfavored by God. But 1878 their punishment is over, which means God will have to regather the nation of Israel once again back. You see, today Israel is formed as a nation, right? But if you look at 200 years from now, 200 years past from now, Israel was not even there in the map. And the Jews they did not live in Israel. They were all scattered. Only in 1878 did the calling start to come. Now, after that, 1878, after the Berlin Congress, they came what is called as a Zionist movement. The Zionist movement was led by a person called as Theodore Herzl. Now, what Theodore Herzl does is he creates a movement. He calls it the Petah Tikva movement, and he says that all the Jewish people will have to go back to their land. And this is again Wikipedia. It starts in 1882. He comes up and he says, you will have to go back to your land, go back to your land. The calling is done. Why did this happen? Why this news was given to the Jews is because Isaiah chapter 40 verses 1 to 2 says, comfort, yes, comfort my people. The Treaty of Berlin was a comfort. Theodore Herzl's movement was a comfort to the Jews. Comfort my people, says your God. Speak comfort to Jerusalem. That speak comfort to the people, and cry out to her that her warfare is ended. The disfavor is ended. That her iniquity is pardoned. I have forgiven her sins. For she has received, look at this, for she has received from the Lord's hand double. We know what double is, right? Mishneh, which means equal, duplicate portion. For she has received from the Lord's hand double for her sins. All her punishment is done. So when God gave her a blessing for 1845 years, they were also disfavored for 1845 years. After the disfavorment, this prophecy revealed itself. It says, call them out. The time is done. The God has pardoned the double Israel, the double sins is completed. Call them out. And that is when in 1878, dear my brothers, in 1878, seven members of the Jewish community, they go into the region, that is the land which was desolate, and they buy a small village. They buy land from a small village, and they name that land called as a Petah Tikva. They call that as a place as Petah Tikva. Today, if you look, Petah Tikva is like this multi-storied skyscrapers, a great city. And when you go into the land, the Jews even though the land belonged to them, they had to give money and they had to buy the land. They had to register the lands on their names. Now, that also is written in prophecy. Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 43, 44. It says, "And fields shall be bought in this land." They'll give money and buy. "Whereof you say, it is desolate without man or beast." The land was desolate, but still people will give money and buy. "Men shall buy fields for money and subscribe evidence." Evidence is like the agreement paper. "Subscribe evidence and seal them with agreement seals, and take witnesses in the land of Benjamin." Exactly as these prophecies, they were fulfilled. People gave money and once again bought back the land. Again in 1909, about 6 men and 4 women, they arrive into a small place called Tel Aviv, and they start to rebuild the city. And today Tel Aviv is like this, a very great city. Now these images that you see are real photographs that were taken in 19 from 1915 to 1920. The Jewish people, because the fishermen, they came with the hook, they came with the bait. The bait was, "Go back to your land, buy your land and start to cultivating it." And many people did not go, just like how you catch one at a time. Just few people started to go slowly, and they started to try to rebuild, but they couldn't. They were built, the entire land was filled with swamp and mosquitoes. Now, this photograph was taken in 1920, and you have the source displayed to you here. Now, so the land was filled with swamps and mosquitoes, and people who went there to rebuild the land, rebuild the Israel land, they couldn't rebuild because they died based on the mosquito bites and malarias and various unknown diseases. They didn't have any treatment for their diseases. The land was built on their bodies. Many people lost their lives. Now, after this, what will happen? Amos 9:14 says, "I will bring my people back to their land. They will rebuild their ruined cities and live there. They will plant vineyards and drink the wine. They will plant gardens and eat what they grow." This prophecy exactly is fulfilled in our days. "I will bring my people back to their land." To their land. The entire Israel is today back into their land. They will rebuild their ruined cities. We just saw the land was ruined, and they've started to rebuild the cities. They will plant vineyards and drink wine, and they will plant gardens and eat what they grow. And it's all done today, right? Now, after the First World War, I'll skip all of these things. This is again Balfour Declaration. It's again another important piece, but we'll just skip due to time. Now, what happens is, again, let's look at Jeremiah prophecy. He says he will send the fishermen. After fishermen, who did he say he will send? He said he will send hunters. We read that, right? "Lo, I send fishermen, and then I will send hunters. Hunters will hunt." The fishermen came from 1878. They started sending out the invitation, and only few people started to go into the nation, not all. Now, after the First World War came the Second World War. During the Second World War, hunters started to come. All the hunters who came, they hunted the Jews like anything. They hunted the Jews from every nook and corner in their cities, and all the hunters was led by a chief hunter called Adolf Hitler. God talks about him in the Bible. Adolf Hitler, he created what is called as the anti-Zionist movement. The Nazis exterminated all the Jews from 1939 to 1945. During the Second World War, Hitler and his Nazi army, they called up many Jews. They took them to Poland, which is a place called as Auschwitz, and they threw them into concentration camps. They filled the concentration camps with gas chambers, and they put as many as Jews into the gas chambers, and they gassed them with poisonous gases. People used to go to these concentration camps to shower themselves. Only when they go stand in the shower, they will realize and they will know that water didn't come from shower. It was instead poisonous gas that was sent on them. They were sent to research. People were tortured. They were placed as targeting billboards in shooting practices. The Nazi armies, they didn't shoot the targets to practice. their aims, their shooting aims, right? But they practiced their shooting aims on the Jews. They let the Jews run and they started shooting the Jews to practice their gunfare. Early morning, the generals would come out of their balconies and they would look at the Jews working just for a sport and fun. They will start shooting out the Jews from their balconies. The Jews were tortured and killed and hunted just like it was prophesied in the book of Jeremiah. They didn't have a place to sleep. The entire children of Abraham suffered at the hands of the hunters. People who were born, children who were born in consecration camp were so disfigured that many thought that they were not even children of human beings, but they were aliens. You can read about this even today. There's a lot of YouTube videos called the Holocaust. You can check that. It's titled the Jewish Holocaust, and you can read a lot of internet pages. It talks and talks so much that the Jewish nation and the people of the Jews were tortured. Even many movies have been made today on the Jewish Holocaust and the consecration camp. People died in numbers. They were just heap of bodies lying everywhere. And whose bodies were these? The Hebrews' bodies, the Jewish people body. They were fed as little as possible. They had no nourishment of food, and they just literally died. Their backs could snap if they couldn't work. The hunters hunted them from every place that they could stand. Approximately 6 million Jews were killed. Approximately, they just give an approximate count. So at the end of the World War II at 1945, the leftover survivors of the Holocaust, the Jewish people, they remembered one thing. They just said to themselves, if we only had a nation, if we only had a nation, and if we were all united, no one could have touched us, right? We should have gone back to our land. Why didn't we go back? Was the statement that made all the Jews think. And since then, my dear brothers and sisters, since then, the Jews started to flock back into their lands one by one. When the fishermen came, they went one by one. But now, after the hunters came, they went in groups. Now, let's look at Ezekiel prophecy. Ezekiel looks into the bones and he says, when Ezekiel said that, all the bones started to come together. And the bones is the house of Israel. God said that. Now, the bones were all scattered across the nation. The Jews were all scattered across the world. Now they're all regathered once again after the hunters came. They all go back into their land. Now, when they're going back into the land, what? So let's look at the process. The bones will have to come. You have flesh, muscles, then you have the nerves, muscles, and then you have skin, and finally you have the breath of life, right? So the bones have started to regather. Now, when they're regathering, how would they go into the nation of Israel? How can they go? Can they walk and go? No, some will go by ships as much as possible. You can also take the plane and you can fly, right? But the Bible says that they would come to their nation on an aeroplane. Now, there was a operation that the many Jews formed and they created. It is called Operation Magic Carpet. You can also check them up today. Operation Magic Carpet was created so that the Jews will be able to come back into their land, and they came on aeroplanes. And the Bible in Isaiah chapter 40 verses 31 says, but those who hope in the Lord, they were waiting, they were hoping, but those who hope in their Lord will renew their strength. They got back their strength because their time of disfavor ended. They got back their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. On wings they soared and came. They came on aeroplanes, on wings they soared, and they came back into their land, dear brothers and sisters. Then finally, in 1948, the state of Israel is born. This is a newspaper clipping that was published by the Palestine Post. The state of Israel was born in 1948 on May 14th. Now the nation is once again regathered, just like Ezekiel saw. The bones regathered. This is what in Jeremiah chapter 30, verses 3, he says, "For behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel and Judah." Israel is the 10 tribes, the Judah is the two tribes. The Lord says, "I will also bring them back to the land that I gave to their forefathers, and they shall possess it." They have come back and now they are possessing the land. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 4 and 5. I will build you up again, and you will be rebuilt, O virgin Israel. Again you will take up your tambourines and go out to dance with joyful. Again you will plant vineyards in the hills of Samaria. The farmers will plant them and enjoy their fruit. All of this happened after they have become a nation. So Ezekiel looks into it, all the bones have come. Now, slowly, flesh, you have nerves, muscles, skin, and then life. We'll see that and we'll just end it, just give about 5 more minutes. Now, what happens is the first prime minister of Israel was David Ben Gurion. Now, what he does is, after the nation was it's a newborn baby nation. Now, what David Ben Gurion does is he wants to further develop his nation. But how to develop? You first have to study about the land. What can I do with the land? What inspired the prime minister is Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 7 to 9. God has told what is there in the land of Israel. So David Ben Gurion studies this, and then he understands that this land is well suited for agriculture, for cultivation, because Deuteronomy chapter 8, from verses 7 to 9, he says this land is a land that has milk and honey, and grapes grows abundantly, pomegranates, then you have figs, all kinds of trees, fruits, vegetables. So this land is beneficial for cultivation, and which is why the Israelis, they first create what is called as a drip irrigation system, which is today used across the world in across farming by many farmers. Drip irrigation system. So first thing that they start to cultivate their land, they start farming in their land, and they call that as kibbutz farming. Kibbutz farming means you gather all the people together, share lands, share maids, share servants, and they will yield it together. The first work that they do is kibbutz farming. So the bones have regathered. Now, what needs to come? Nerves. Then you have muscles, and then you have skin. Nerves is given to us in our body to carry blood, oxygen, and all the vitals from one part of the body into another part. So it's necessary for us to live, right? Just like that, food is necessary for anyone to survive. And the first thing that God gives them is like nerves. He gives them agriculture, food for them to survive. And based on that, the muscles, their strength is renewed. And today you see, farming is one of the greatest thing that Israel does. Then the skin will have to come. What is skin? Skin is given for us to protect our flesh, right? Without skin, our flesh is exposed to all kinds of bacteria that is there in this air and environment. So skin is to protect us. So the next thing that Israel does is they read Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 9. It says that the land of Israel is filled with mountains made out of iron and copper. So the prime minister then starts to mine all these mountains, and they export iron ore, they export copper, and based on that they build protection is nothing but their defense system. Today, one of the biggest defense system in the world, and the most prominent ones, is the defense system of Israel. Not just their defense system, but every Israel army and every army personnel is so strong and so vigilant and talented that they have the most high tech weapons. And one of the most weapon that is spoken about in many of these days is what they have is called as an iron dome. An iron dome can deflect rockets and deflect missiles in midair from collision into their earth surfaces, into their lands. So they have the greatest technology, which is why God gave them skin. And one of the newspaper clippings says that one of the terrorists says this in the newspaper. He says, their God, that's Israel, their God changes the path of our rockets in midair, said a terrorist. So terrorist is saying that God changes the path of the midair. So today, Israel is, all the bones have been gathered, the nerves are there, and they have the flesh, but still one thing is still remaining. They still do not have life in them. If they had life, they would have recognized Jesus. They still today, they don't recognize the Messiah. Instead, they are claiming false messiahs and they're running after different things. So still the life is not restored back to them, which is why Ezekiel chapter 37 verses 9, Ezekiel says, God says, prophesy to the wind, four winds, and from the four wind, life would come to them. Now, what is this? What is this four winds from which life comes to them? Revelation chapter 7 talks about the four wind. In Revelation chapter 7, there is an angel that comes from the east direction, and then the angel says there's four other angels that are standing towards the earth. They are ready to leave out the winds on the earth. So the angel says, hang on, don't do that. There are still God's chosen people in this world on whose head the seal has to be placed. Until the seal is placed, hold on, don't leave the four winds. Now what are these four winds? Wind represents tribulation. Winds represent the great time of trouble, and the four winds are left is called the tribulation to the government, the worldly government, tribulation to the worldly religion, tribulation to economy, and tribulation to social. These are the four systems that are actually controlling the world. Government, that's political system, religious system, social system, that is your commerce and business, and then you have economy system. If these four system collapses, the entire administration of this universe, right, just collapses. So far we've seen winds being trembled only on certain, maybe a government just collapses but the remaining three stays on, and then you have the religious system just going down, but you still have social and economy, all that. So all of this is happening one by one, but at the end, this is what the Bible calls as the great day of trouble in Matthew chapter 24. He also says the final battle, the battle of the Armageddon, which is mentioned in the book of Revelation. All of this will happen when the four winds are left on this earth. Now, recall the prophecy of Ezekiel. He says, the life to Israel will come from the four winds, which means Israel will come back to their senses that Messiah was the one who came to us when the world is at war. Is because there are few biblical verses. We'll just see this as soon as possible and end the discourse. So firstly, he says, Zechariah chapter 12 verses 10, he says, I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him. Finally they will mourn for him, and on as one who mourns for the only son, and they will weep bitterly over him. Why they will weep bitterly over him is because Zechariah chapter 14 verses 2, it says that God will call all the nations to fight against Israel. Today, America supports Israel, right? Many other global nations, they are in favor of Israel, but God will make them all their enemies. Israel will be singled out. All the nations that we are today living in, all the countries, they will go to war against one country, which is Israel. Zechariah chapter 14 verses 2 gives this prophecy, and then Israel would become a burden stone for everyone. They will just want to kill Israel, and that is when, my dear brothers and sisters, the people of the Israel will realize, and they will turn to God and they will pray to him. Then they will finally know that Jesus is the one that they pierced, which is what the verse says, so that they would look to me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as the one who mourns for the only son. Only after that, the Lord will go and fight for them. In that day, the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the one who is feeble among them in that day will be like David, like how David fought, and the house of David will be like God, like the angel of the Lord before them. And in that day, I will set about to destroy all nations that come against Jerusalem. Any nation that everyone who came against Jerusalem will be defeated. How? In a nuclear war. A nuclear war is due to come, as Zechariah 14:12 says. Now, this will be a plague. He calls this as a plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples who have gone to war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot. Their flesh will rot. You know, when the flesh would rot, if we look at a nuclear warfare, and if a nuclear just breaks open, right? Even if we are miles apart, the gas that comes out of the nuclear and the effect of the nuclear bomb that is just being exploded, we will just evaporate. People who are trying to survive in their bunkers, they will just evaporate. And people who are left as survivors, due to the polluted oxygen, the ones that they breathe in, they will die out of several kinds of cancers. That's what he says as a plague. The Lord will strike all people who have gone to war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they stand on the feet, which means when a person is just standing, immediately his flesh will rot. That is the effect of a nuclear explosion. And their eyes will rot in their sockets while their eyes are still visible. Immediately it would rot, and their tongue will rot in their mouth. Why? Is because God will then would have given them the life. Ezekiel chapter 39 verses 29. I will no longer hide my face from them any longer, for I have poured out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the Lord. This is what he will pour out and house. And finally, people who survive, they will go to the Jews and they will say, we've heard that your God is a true God. Kindly please take me to your God. Show me who is that God. The leftover people of that war, they will go to the remaining Jews and they will ask them this question. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, in those days it shall come to pass that 10 men shall take hold of all languages of the nations, even shall take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you. They'll come to the Jew and say, we want to go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. They will all come there. Isaiah chapter 2 verses 2 to 3. Now it shall come to pass in the last day, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. Many people shall say, come and say, come and let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his path. When will all this happen? After Israel comes alive, which means when they come to the realization and realize that Jesus is the Messiah, then the final climax will happen. Today, dear brothers and sisters, you and I are living in the final climax time. We are already there because the bones have been regathered. The skin has already come, which means the nerves, flesh, the skin, everything is there. Now they're standing as an army. The only thing remaining is from the four winds, they will need to get life. Now, the four winds in Revelation 7 says, hold on. There are still people here, God's chosen people. Wait until their foreheads are sealed. And who are these God's chosen people? 144,000 bride of Christ. And this is the calling that you and I have received, dear brothers and sisters. Let us make our calling and election sure. Let us become the 1 lakh, one member among that 1 lakh and 44. The world is waiting for us to complete our course. Let us be very cautious about our calling. Let us not just think it is just like another study or another calling that we are here. The calling is for the wedding banquet to become the bride of Christ, and God has given this calling. Let us make our election a call. Let us make our calling and election sure, and the four winds are just waiting for us. If the 1 lakh and 44 is completed with or without us, the four winds will come on this earth, and that is called the great time of trouble, the great tribulation, the time of the Armageddon. And that is when all nations will go against Israel, and Israel will be singled out, and then they will realize and turn back to God. God will defeat all the countries that came to fight against Israel, and the leftover survivors will go to the Jews and say, please take me to your God. We know that God is there with you. Until we study another prophecy, let us keep this in mind, and let us not become weary of our calling, but run our race with more supplication and with more guidance and concentration. Let us walk in the light while the light is still shining among us. May God bless us for giving us this wonderful truth, and may God bless you also for the time that you've spared in hearing his wonderful message. Amen.